But as we look at Matthew chapter 23, we see a lot of, if you've got a red letter edition, you're seeing red, 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 red. This is Jesus railing against the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Now, I want us to note, first of all, as I think I mentioned last week, the Pharisees weren't all bad. They just ended up down the path of rule following as a means of pleasing God, to the extent that they became so proud of their rule following that was their religion, that actually displaced relationship with God. So the Pharisees went from understanding who God was, allowing God to speak into their lives and to have a relationship with Him and to be obedient to the law because that pleased God, into this transactional religion, just like all the made-up ancient religions that said, we do these good things and God will therefore bless us. I'm in the book of Job right now as I'm reading through, actually I just finished it, I think. Reading through the Bible this year. And if you remember, the theme of Job was a righteous man. He was so righteous that God said to Satan, as he was accusing Job, God said to Satan, and don't try to get me to explain this conference that God had with Satan. But God said, hey, have you seen Job? He's a good guy. And Satan said, well, of course he's good. You do nothing but good for him. Why would he be anything other than good? And God said, do whatever you want, but don't take his life, and we'll see. And Job remained righteous, and he was distressed, and he was debating with God a little bit, but he maintained his belief and faith in God. And what did his four friends do? Job, quit saying that you merit God's favor, because if you really hadn't sinned, really weren't guilty of anything, you wouldn't be going through all these hard times. Wow, we haven't changed our religion very much, have we? You do good things, you make God happy, God makes you happy. It's a wonderful religion. It's transactional. It's not grace-filled. So what I find interesting about chapter 23 of Matthew, we tend to think of hypocrites as somebody who drinks all night on Saturday, is sober enough to come to church and sing the hymns and do all the nice church things on Sunday, and then goes to the workplace Monday and tells dirty jokes and cusses. That's the hypocrite. Oh, you're one way on Sunday, but the other days you're not. But that's not the kind of hypocrisy that Jesus was addressing with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were the best of the best. They were not hypocrites in terms of their behavior. They taught obedience to the law, and they obeyed the law. So that wasn't the way that they were hypocritical. The way that they were hypocritical is that they supposedly knew how to be in a relationship with God, but they chose to be in relationship with their own sense of righteousness, and more dastardly than that, more erroneous than that, they taught others that that was the way that you're supposed to be. And in so doing, incurred the wrath of Christ. Let's take a look. Scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses, Jesus says. Again, as a reminder, the Pharisees came into being. They were not the priestly class, but they tended to be in charge of synagogues. And remember, there was one temple. The Sadducees and the priestly class pretty much took care of the temple things, and the Pharisees were in charge of the synagogues. If you had 10 Jewish men, you could start your own home church, so to speak, and that was the synagogue. And so the Sadducees, we don't see anything about them after the destruction of the temple in AD 70 because they didn't have anything to do, because there was no temple. And the Pharisees were more concerned about the law, and they were able to continue even though there was no sacrificial system after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. They just studied the laws and the rules and the meaning and the symbolism. So really, today's rabbinical Judaism is an outgrowth of the Pharisees. So the Pharisees did good things, and there were some good Pharisees. The one that provided the defense to Jesus, and the one that came to him by night, and the one that gave Jesus his tomb. And the scribes were the lawyers. They really did scribe things, but in doing so, they preserved the Old Testament. We have to give them a lot of credit. And there was another group called the Essenes that we don't see a lot of, but we do have them mentioned in the Bible. And those were the ones that preserved the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we found a few hundred years later, somewhere around the 1940s, that validated the accuracy of the Old Testament. So we kind of throw all these people together, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Sadducees. But Jesus was talking particularly to these law obeyers. Scribes and Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. One of the reasons this is a living illustration of me sitting in the chair. It's my chair. I'm the one that has the right to elucidate you in the truth of the Scripture. Chair of Moses. That word in the original language is cathedra, and so. When you hear the word cathedral, and we have those of you that have been involved in the academic world, one of your bosses, like the chair of sociology or the chair of business, or you have an endowed chair, the department chair. So we still have that kind of language. And Jesus said, well, that's legitimate. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it, but don't do what they do. Yeah. Because they don't practice what they teach. Mm-hmm. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. One of the authenticators of our faith is knowing Scripture and knowing how we need to behave because of what the Bible teaches us. Another authenticator of our faith and our walk and our discipleship is sharing that knowledge with others. We call that witnessing in the religious language. Witnessing by our life, witnessing by our testimony. But a third authenticator is, do we live out what we're teaching others and what we know to do? And without that third authenticator, then we question our faith. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. I think we can imagine the intonation of Jesus as he says this. Have you ever and I don't know what the original language is. I don't know how this is translated, whether it's literally lift a finger, whether that's a saying that was kind of imposed to be equal to the original language. I didn't research that. But have you ever heard that phrase, lift a finger? Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard it said happily? No. Right? It's always in a condemning kind of language. You haven't lifted a finger, right? They do everything to be seen by others. They enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. Now, I'm sure you've heard enough sermons and teaching about the Pharisees that you know what a phylactery is. But the Old Testament talks about, writing the words on your heart, on your hand, and keeping it on your in a prominent place. And so they would literally have little scripture cards. Anybody ever been a navigator or known a navigator? I had a bus driver who was a college student when I was in high school. And he always had this little packet of scripture cards. He was always memorizing scripture cards. Well, if he was a Pharisee, he would have that packet of scripture cards taped to his forehead and wrapped around his wrists so that the words were always before him. And the utility of that is questionable. And they like to have really big ones, like instead of just the business card size, they'd have like 3x5 card phylacteries. And another thing that if you look back into Leviticus and some of these Old Testament rule books, when it talks about the vestments of the priests, there were cords and strands and in different colors that had meaning. And so the Pharisees would say, well, if the cord's supposed to be this long, then I'm going to make it this long. And I'm going to make it that special hue of blue. And I'm going to make it gold. And I'm going to make it big. So you would never not know that a Pharisee was walking down the street. Because they would have, and it's almost a comical sight to think about. They would have these, basically what amounted to, I'm a Christian billboard on their foreheads. They loved the place of honor at banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplace, and to be called rabbi by people. I remember reading about Billy Graham feeling really hesitant. People were always trying to pick him up in limousines. Yet I remember a story about Mother Teresa, who was at a White House reception and was offered a cookie. And she thought, the people that I serve back in the streets of India don't have the luxury of having a cookie. I don't have the right to have a cookie. And she gave that some thought, and then she said, maybe just one. But special treatment, special places. I don't have any problem with pastors sitting behind a big, beautiful pulpit with all kinds of fancy stuff. We're in a simple church. I didn't have anything to do with the design or the decor of the church, but I always felt a little uncomfortable being up on stage. And if, however, somebody ever wanted to donate one of those clear lucite things that the televangelists have, I would use that. And here's some confusing teaching, and I'm not going to worry about us being too literal about it. You're not to be called rabbi because you have one teacher. And you are called brothers and sisters. Do not call anyone on earth your father because you have one Father who's in heaven. You are not to be called instructors either because you have one instructor, the Messiah. The first time I ever had an interaction with a Catholic priest and everybody was calling him Father, I couldn't quite get myself to say Father. I don't have any problem now. It's just a title. People call me pastor or reverend. I do like when the church I grew up, everybody was brother. So my dad was Brother Howard. My pastor was Brother Dale. So it was kind of an equalizing thing. So I have fond memories of that. And it's interesting that we hear Paul, later the Apostle Paul, really struggling to enforce his identity as an apostle, not just for the label or the title, but for the authority. So these labels, these delineations, I don't think they're inherently evil, but I've had a lot of titles in my life. I'm Dr. Schultz, Pastor Schultz, I've been Professor Schultz, I've been Judge Schultz, I've been Chief Schultz, I've been Sergeant Schultz. And the only thing I really covet is Grandpa Schultz, and there's only one person that gives me that title. But I got to tell you, the first time I went to an International Association of Chiefs of Police convention, I just went to the trade show, which is like, it's a toy store for, it's great. Tanks and motorcycles and guns. And I was walking along by one of the vendors, and I was not, I was a teacher. I was teaching criminal justice. And I was walking by this vendor booth, and the guy said, "Hey, Chief, I want to show you this." And I was like, "Chief, I like that." I did not correct him. I reveled in that. So we need to be careful about the elevation and the ego associated with titles. And I'll have to agree with the Apostle Paul that my resume is dumb. It really is meaningless. It means nothing. It's not a transactional relationship. There's no merit. Only grace. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you don't go in, and you don't allow those entering to go in. We're still in a phase that developed a couple of decades ago with the philosophy of seeker-friendly churches. And I think we all ought to be seeker-friendly. I think we ought to be welcoming to those that are questioning and looking. What's the meaning of life? What's the truth? Is the Bible real? Is God real? Is Jesus real? What difference does that make? We need to be friendly to seekers, but we cannot avoid speaking truth with a capital T just because we might offend somebody who is ignorant of the reality of Scripture. Nor, I think, should we try to be so appealing and entertaining that people would come for the concert and not really be seekers other than seeking an experience. And again, maybe that makes me judgmental. But how many accommodating pulpits are inviting people in to something other than accepting the lordship of Jesus in their life? I know there are churches and good, fine, healthy churches with good leaders who will say, I'm going to give everybody that attends more than 2 or 3 times, they're going to give them a position so that they'll feel part of the church. I'm going to have them handing out bulletins. I'll make them, on a visitation team or something like that. And the Bible's pretty clear about positions of authority within the church. You need to be vetted, and you're not supposed to be a new believer. There's a whole manual, and certainly we as Southern Baptists have it. I get stuff in the mail all the time to the church. This program, this set of literature, this pamphlet, this CD with stuff on it, this sermon series. And I'm like, some of that's good stuff. But I often feel like Jesus when he said, I played funeral songs for you and you didn't cry, and I played wedding music for you and you didn't dance. What do you want? We just need to be careful about appealing to people with the wrong message, hoping that they'll get a little taste of the gospel somewhere and think, oh, maybe I'll take that path. Now, obviously, as I've said before, I know people that came to Vacation Bible School because they were giving away ice cream and they ended up hearing the gospel and got saved. So I'm not against doing things that are entertaining and appealing. But when we lose our focus, then what kind of convert are we making? Woe to you blind guides. Well, the rest of the chapter, and I need to close, is talking about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They believed, of course, that because they were descendants of Abraham, they relied on their DNA and their family history. And Jesus points out, okay, if you're going to claim a relationship with God because of your family history, I want you to remember that your ancestors killed all the prophets that I sent and ignored them. So you got to claim that history too, if anything. Jesus looked at them and said, oh yeah, you would say if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would have taken part with them in shedding the prophet's blood. And yet, before the week was over, they were begging for the crucifixion of Christ. Verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. It's easy to look at the Pharisees and say, and that's an example of hypocrisy, and I appreciate Jesus giving us this story so that we can know how not to be hypocrites. But these were the people who were religious leaders. They were doing what they thought was the right thing, or at least they were doing things that they did in order to please people. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves in American Christianity is Jesus weeping over America's churches? I wanted you to make disciples. I wanted you to acknowledge my lordship over your life. But you're in the entertainment business. You're in the compromise business. You're in the shaping culture business. There are a lot of churches in this community, and I'm very happy that many of them are healthy and active. And I'm sure they're preaching the gospel. And I'm not in competition with anybody. But here's one thing that I want us to be able to say of our church. Regardless of how we may expand or improve or change, that we must always be disciple makers by studying the Word. And that is our strength. It won't be in our numbers. Won't be in our entertainment value. But it will be the opportunity to learn more about Christ. That's my prayer anyway.